part of the work, having that passion is to go out and find those people and tell them the story and talk to them about the need.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I am your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. There are over 1.8 million nonprofits in the United States, and tens of thousands of new ones are formed every year. Unfortunately, tens of thousands also fail. With 10% of the workforce employed in nonprofits, including many of you listeners, I thought I would use my experience with one particular organization to examine nonprofits, how they are founded, and what it takes to survive and thrive. That nonprofit is Home Base Youth Services. Just over 30 years ago, when I was in my late teens, I had a hand in starting Home Base. I don't discuss my role very often. The fact that I was a teenager at the time brought attention to me and away from some of the others who were involved, and I'm not proud of that, nor am I proud of the mistakes I made at the time. I am, however, very happy that Home Base survives and just recently added a second location. So, over the next several episodes of Talking About Kids, I am going to use Home Base to examine what it is like to found a nonprofit, to examine the role of a nonprofit board of directors in good times and in bad, and to look at what it is like to manage a mature 30-year-old nonprofit and embed it in a community. My guest this episode to discuss the founding of a nonprofit is Dan Minton. Dan was the first executive director of Home Base, a position that came with very little pay and a lot of heartache. Today, Dan is the associate vice president of the Steyer Group, a national firm that assists nonprofit with fundraising and capital campaigns. This podcast was sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. And now, the interview.
I've always gravitated towards something where I feel like I'm doing something for others. And even in my current job that I have now, my current position, it's fundraising, but the bulk of our business, the great bulk, 95% of it, is working with Catholic churches, schools, and dioceses around the country. So when I'm helping them raise money to build a new building, it's what happens in those buildings that makes the difference for the people in those communities. And so I kind of feel like it's still, helping people, even though I'm in a for-profit business.
Well, and I have to imagine that conviction that you hold is something that always drew me to you. We've known each other for a very long time. And we're going to talk about the very early days of Home Base. Well, first of all, can you tell my listeners what is Home Base?
Home Base Youth Services is a nonprofit that we started for homeless and runaway youth in Phoenix, Arizona. I think, if I remember correctly, and help me out, but we kind of it was a brainchild of ours, probably even more so yours than mine, to have our junior high group at the church do something for kids their own age. What could they do? Are we collecting socks or underwear or, shoes or whatever? And the more we looked into who would receive these things that we would collect, we found that there wasn't really any services available, very few services available to kids in that age group. And so the more we talked about it and the more we kind of did research, it seemed like there was a need that we might be able to meet.
Yeah, there really did. I mean, I specifically remember seeing some sort of expose on a local TV show about homeless kids in Phoenix. And I remember that being kind of a light bulb. I remember talking to you about it.
Yeah.
And I know that at some point we decided we needed to ask for help from like the most powerful adult that we knew, right? Because that was kind of like we
Yeah.
knew we were going to do something, but we weren't exactly sure what. Is that? I mean,
Yeah.
that's my recollection.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And as you're talking about it, I can remember
Yeah.
the feeling of, can we really do something?
Yeah.
I mean, really? Like, we could really do something? Yeah, I remember, I remember the one pivotal moment was, we were looking for some seed money to get going.
Yeah.
Do you remember that? And the pastor at the church called over the loudspeaker of all the phones and called me into his office. And I'm like,
Never good.
That's
No.
usually not a good thing. Yeah, right. But he had just met with a parishioner who had come in and said, my mother had died and left me some money, and I don't know what to do with it. I want to do something that honors her legacy. And he had told this nice woman, I have an idea. and she was okay with it. And so, next thing we know, we've got some seed money to get the thing going.
That the story that seed money comes up again, and we're going to hear about it in a later episode because that was important for the very first board of Home Base 2. But before there was ever a board, what I can recall is that we wanted to do something, and again we had the most powerful person that you and I knew at the time was the pastor of the church, and
Yes.
so I think I remember why I drew the short straw in having that meeting with him about doing something. And I think it was because at the time, I don't know how secure you were with your relationship with him, but I think I went into that first meeting alone, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
And at the time, I've always had a little bit more passion than sense. And I kind of went in looking for a fight. I do recall that because I went in not to just pitch the idea, but for some reason I contrasted it against the fact that we were raising money to build buildings. So I remember saying to him, we're raising all this money to build new buildings, and what we need to be doing is housing homeless and runaway kids. And I just was mentally, spiritually, my dukes were up for some reason, which was not an unusual stance for me at the time, or clear, to this day. And I just remember him saying, "Okay," and that was what was crazy is, and when I talk with other people about starting things like this, the number of people that they expect to say no and then says okay. There's a lot of those stories, right? But that okay was, well, you're going to have to learn more about what this means. And he knew about Covenant House. And so even before that seed money, he shipped you and me to New York City to learn about Covenant House. What do you remember of that trip?
Was that was before the seed money?
My understanding, if I recall correctly, that came first because that's when we had the manual. Remember, we got the manual for how to start a shelter for homeless and runaway kids that we got from Covenant House. And because that's when they started us doing our own needs assessment. If that's what I'm recalling.
Correct. Right? That's correct.
So we had a little bit of support.
Yeah, they gave us. They gave us that book that allowed us to do our own needs assessment to prove that there was, need for it in our valley.
And in retrospect, I think that was so smart of the pastor. I think too often when people start initiatives like this, they don't pay enough attention to what came before them or what else is going out there or what they can learn from different locations, maybe people working with different populations, but there is knowledge out there that can really help and give you a leg up on what you're trying to accomplish. And that for us, I think, was Covenant House at the time.
Yeah, I agree. I have a lot of really vivid memories of that. Even just riding the subways.
Yeah.
Just being nervous about that. But the way we were treated there was wonderful. The people in their facilities were wonderful. And then I think a providence or a God moment for us was that one of their vice presidents ended up moving to Phoenix with a new job, and we were able to use his expertise for a few more years.
Absolutely.
And his job was to open new shelters for Covenant House in various locations. And in fact, if I recall, he said that Phoenix was on the list as a future site for a Covenant House. So he was glad that there was people with the willingness and the energy to do it at that time.
Now, what was interesting is, despite the fact that we were really passionate about it, at least my recollection is, until going on outreach with Covenant House in New York City, we hadn't talked a lot with homeless and runaway kids before that.
No, only those at the church
who
had homes and at least one parent, right?
Right. And those kids would, they would get into all sorts of, tomfoolery for sure, and run away and spend time away from their home. But they weren't the kind of kids that had been chronically living on the streets the way that we encountered in New York City. So that's what was eye-opening for me, was sitting in those in that outreach van and pulling up, and the kids would get in to have a cocoa or a sandwich, which was what was giving out. And the other piece of that I is something that I carry with me to all of my work now, is that even though the Covenant House was terribly interested in getting those kids into a program, getting them into a home with a case manager, what the first thing that they said to them always was, "Are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Do you want to get warm?" And they were very deliberate about not trying to force the program on them. They recognized that that trust had to be established well before you could kind of make that big of a difference in their lives. At least that's what I took from that.
Right. And I would add just one other piece would be that they wanted them to know that they're safe.
Yeah.
And that's part of that whole trust thing. We're going to be here. They would say that. We'll be back tomorrow, those kind of things. And just building those relationships little by little.
It was odd, too, that there hadn't really been kind of a census of homeless and runaway kids before then. And the fact that our next step, and actually it was probably one of the only things that was in our skill set, was to go out on the streets and count and find out where they were hanging out and watch for the patterns. And when I say patterns, you and I had been taught that there was kind of a way that kids got exploited when they were running away. And we were taught some things to look out for. Do you remember that?
I don't remember that, no.
So I think it was the gentleman we were talking about from Covenant House that told us, go to the bus stations.
Oh, yeah.
And he said, go to the bus stations, because not to see who's coming off the bus, because that's where kids will be. They'll get off that bus. But watch who's waiting for new buses to come into town. And then you might be able to follow them to find out where other homeless and runaway kids are hanging out or being exploited. And so, I remember with a mutual friend of ours one time kind of trailing this really sketchy, fancy car that would make a loop between the loop, which became known as the loop in Central Phoenix, and the Greyhound bus station, to just see.
Wow.
Yeah.
I had forgotten about that. I do remember a street or a couple of streets in downtown that were very particular to homeless and runaway youth and those who had to work the streets in order to survive. And it was a really bad part of town in the sense that there were lots of homes there that were all boarded up and that people would, break into or whatever to sleep. But Yeah, I remember that loop. Wow.
Yeah, and of course I just remember so much of the dissonance. Coming from a home where I felt safe and secure,
Mm-hmm.
and seeing what these young people had to do to survive, and also seeing
Mm-hmm.
who was taking advantage of them too. Adults that were supposed to be
Right.
protecting or looking out for young people were the ones that were there that were harming them. That was really difficult. Um, the role of a founder is different than the role of somebody running a mature program, or, even somebody getting an initiative off the ground in a larger organization. And you've had multiple roles in nonprofits and in organizations that serve nonprofits. When you think about the skills that are necessary to found a nonprofit, what do you think those skills are?
Mm-hmm. The first skill would be, well, I don't know if it's a skill, but you need to have passion for the work.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we didn't know what we were doing. We were lucky to get a manual
Yeah.
that talked about how to open a facility, and we sort of customized that to us and to our Valley of the Sun, those kind of things, and to the other agencies that were around. So you got to have the passion, and the next thing would be you need to start to put together a group of people that have a lot of different skill sets that are strong.
Mm-hmm.
They might have access to people with money, or they might have access to other nonprofits, or to government representatives. But part of the work, having that passion, is to go out and find those people and tell them the story,
Yeah.
and talk to them about the need. And then once one person's on, and another person's on, and they have their own skill sets, they're able to tell the story, or oftentimes bring one of us along to talk to one of their people. And it just grew into a board of people that then could provide guidance or access to others. And
Yeah,
that's
and I think that getting that passion to translate too, and to put that passion in other people. I think that when you were in a position like you and I were in, I mean, sometimes I felt that people wanted to hear us talk or present because we were two young guys, and that was weird, right? That we were two young
mm-hmm.
guys that cared about this and we're trying to do this thing. But
That's interesting.
yeah, and maybe that's just the benefit of hindsight, but it wouldn't have gotten off the ground if we hadn't figured out how to put that passion into other people that actually knew what they were doing.
Yeah. Yeah, again, I think that manual really helped us. It forced us to go out and do that needs assessment. And part of that needs assessment was for us to go out and meet with agencies,
Mm-hmm.
to see what they're doing, and to meet them, and to hear their frustrations, and frankly, to hear their sense of competition.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was very off-putting a number of times when they would be discouraging of us to do what we thought was a great thing. And then I can remember walking out of meetings like that, or having conversations, saying, they're not doing enough.
Yeah.
And yet they're just, all they care about is, the 3 or 4 beds. They don't care to have them to be 10 beds or 20 beds. They're just, I felt like some of those organizations that were serving youth were doing it to do the work.
Yep.
But not doing it for the benefit of doing the work, to actually make a difference. And that was eye-opening, and I think that's why we ended up being successful for at least the short period I was around.
I think you're exactly right. And I don't know how this next comment is going to land, because I think that there are people in all sorts of lines that need a paycheck. And I get that. Don't get me wrong. I completely get that. But when you're in a service industry, if you're in public service, especially if you're doing something like shelter work, working with people who are unhoused, working with people who are exploited, if your passion is for a paycheck, it is going to be a really hard job for you. And you're going to make decisions, I believe, you're going to make decisions that ultimately neither benefit you nor benefit the population that your job is supposed to support.
There's not a lot of money
No.
in service work, or in, social work type of work. So, if money's your factor, you're in the wrong business. And so you really need to have that passion for the work you do, especially for the people you're serving. Yeah.
And I think that also goes back to the other way that people in direct service get compensated is in pride. And that's the other thing that I understand totally, right? You're proud of the work that you're doing. And then sometimes that creates its own difficulties because that gets expressed in ownership. This is mine, right? So I'm doing it. I don't want your help. I don't want you to be doing it too. This is me and who I am. And by the way, I get it, because if you're not getting paid, one of the ways to feel compensated is with that sense of pride and ownership. But ultimately, it doesn't help the population you're trying to serve.
Yeah, my nonprofit is doing the work of all these youth, even though it's doing the work of a small portion of those youth, that kind of thing.
I think that was that was probably the number one lesson that I took away from my experience with home base was that is to not make the work about yourself. And that was by the way, very hard lesson for me to learn. Don't get me wrong. It was, I was young and it was difficult. And a lot of my identity was in being involved in home base. And when I couldn't anymore, that felt really difficult. What sort of lessons did you take away from those early days with home base that you still apply in the work that you do now?
Well, I think we've touched on it, that it's really about the people. And I keep that in mind even when I'm at the gas station or the convenience store and somebody comes up and asks for $5 for the bus or something, right? I generally give them money if I have it, but what I do is I ask them their name. And I ask if it's okay if I pray for them when I go home or, when I do my prayers. Because I think that gives them a little bit of humanity. They're not just somebody who's taken $5, but somebody asked them their name. I think I hope that's what I think is I don't think people. I think they get a lot of $5. I don't think they get a lot of people saying, I hear you, and God bless you, Betty or John or whatever. So. That's what I one of the things I take away. That might go back to just who I am and the work I love to do. But I think that was important, and I think it was important that we found out those lessons when we were in the vans, or meeting with those kids that we were afraid of.
One of the things that a lot of people struggle with when they're trying to get a nonprofit off the ground is this funding piece. And, you being a professional fundraiser right now, something that I've heard people say, I can tell you about my experience with it, but I'd like to hear yours first, is that it's not that you're trying to get money out of somebody, it's that you're providing them with an opportunity to do something good that they want to do. Is that your experience?
It is. There's two things there. That one, people give to people. And so if you're talking to somebody, especially somebody with money, they want to do something purposeful with the funds that they have, whether they're a religious person and believe that this is something that they're able to do because of a gift from God, or, has blessed them with this money, or if it's somebody who just has $10 and they want it to see it go to good use. It's the personal relationship that makes that transaction happen. But the transaction also has to be encouraging their participation in something greater. And there's a great book by Henry Nouwen called The Spirituality of Fundraising that I've read a bunch of times. It's probably 35 pages. It's nothing. But it's really good, and it talks about the perspective from the person who's being asked for money. And they want to feel they want to feel like they are encouraged. They want to feel like they're important. They want to know why they're being asked, and of course, they want to know what good their money will go to, or their gift will go to. And if you can talk to them about that, and then give them that chance to participate in something great, then they're willing to let it go. Yeah, it's a wonderful thing.
My sort of experience with that, and if we expand the definition from giving to not just monetary, but time and expertise, you and I had learned that a lot of homeless and runaway youth ended up in juvenile detention and correction centers. And we had a contact, the pastor out at Adobe Mountain Correction Facility, juvenile correction facility. And I asked him, I don't know if you remember this, I asked him if I could come out and learn a little bit from the youth out there. And he said to me, you can come out and talk to the youth here if you do a program for them. So do a night, do a presentation for them, and then you can make part of your presentation learning from them. So at the ripe old age of 19, I put together some sort of presentation that I was doing for the junior high kids at the church. Something about self-esteem or something like that, right? And I went out there, and I immediately recognized that I did not know these people. I did not know their experiences well enough to be teaching them anything. And I remember like floundering just the entire time to a room full of crossed arms and scowling faces. And at some point, though, I kind of transitioned into talking to them about their own experience and telling them about what we were trying to do with home base. And then they understood, but more importantly, they were incredibly, incredibly generous with their ideas and their insights. And as they were leaving, these young men, like each one of them kind of went by and kind of comforted me, kind of patted me on the shoulder and be like, "You'll be okay. It's all right. You'll be okay. You'll make it. Don't worry. You'll be okay. It'll work. You'll get over this. You'll get." And I was genuinely thanking them because I asked for and received help from a bunch of incarcerated kids, and that stuck with me for sure.
Yeah. And look where it's taken you,
All the way
honestly,
to...
your work has been with kids forever.
Yeah. Well, it's but it's because of that knot in the gut if I turn away from it for too long, for sure.
Right.
Dan, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today and for being an inspiration in my life. You've been like a big brother to me at that time and over the course of my life. And I just want to thank you for all the patience you've had with me and for everything you do for any community that you're involved in. You're a good man, Dan Minton.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I could say the same thing about you. You've been the guy that's got the idea.
That was Dan Minton. For more information about Dan and the Steyer Group and Home Base Youth Services, please visit talkingaboutkids.com. My examination of the management of nonprofits continues next week with Neil Sutton. He and I will discuss the role of a nonprofit board of directors in good times and in bad. So please subscribe. You will not want to miss it. As always, our theme song is by The Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young children, and the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.